I don't think I need to tell you why we picked democracy under siege as this year's theme. It is self-evident to every single one of you. I will just say that there is an urgency to this topic. We need to do something quickly, or the authoritarian forces abroad and here at home will make it too late to do anything. And that is why we are so thrilled tonight to have our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker tonight understands very well what is at stake, and they have committed their life to doing something about it. And of course, I'm talking about Peggy Nash. Peggy Nash is currently the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She's a co-instructor of a unique experimental program, Women in the House. She's a former NDP Member of Parliament, where she served as the official opposition critic in finance and industry. She is author of the book, Women Winning Office, an Activist's Guide to Getting Elected, which has been called, quote, a masterclass in electoral politics. And prior to becoming a parliamentarian, Peggy was a senior labor negotiator with the CAW, now Unifor these days, where she led negotiations in the auto, airlines, and service sector. She also developed groundbreaking human rights and equity programs for which she was named to the Order of Canada and awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws from Brock University. And so finally, after your patience, I'm glad to welcome to the podium Peggy Nash.
So, the fate of democracy in the face of growing authoritarianism. Sadly, an important and urgent topic. I want to thank Jason Foster, Ricardo Acuna, and all of the staff at Parkland for organizing this amazing event in this province. How timely, how prescient of you to do this. It's a pleasure to join you this evening in the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples, part of Treaty 6 and home of the Métis Nation. Now, I want to start off with an anecdote. As Jason said, I was a member of Parliament, and I was recruited by Jack Layton to run for elected office, and I never saw myself as a politician or playing that kind of role. But I did run for the nomination. It was contested, and I won. And I want to tell you a story about the first day that I was out canvassing. How many here have been out canvassing? Yeah, in the winter? Yeah, we are in Edmonton. Well, I remember vividly my first day, and I was very nervous because I don't mind canvassing for an issue or canvassing for other people, but I went canvassing with a big glossy leaflet with my picture on the front because we really wanted to say there's a new person in town here. And we had never won this riding for the NDP, but we thought we're gonna make a statement here. So, you know, it's February, it's this gray, cloudy day, and in one hand I'm clutching my clipboard, and in the other I've got a stack of these leaflets, and I'm so nervous. Like, I was nervous that, well, because I don't know, it felt weird being the person who was on the leaflet. Also, what would people say? What reaction would I get? So I went door to door, and I'm with the team, and it was really going well. And then it started to snow, as it does in February. And little by little, these glossy leaflets are smattered with snow stains, and I'm going to the door, and I'm handing this leaflet of this kind of crumply picture. And people would look at it, and they'd look up at me, and I must have been snow encrusted by this point. And I thought, well, this is so ridiculous. I don't know what I was worried about. Like, it can't get any sillier than this. But I think back to that day because I took 3 things away from canvassing. And the first thing was that most people are so kind at the doorstep. Not universally, some people can't be bothered, but most people, if you ask them questions and listen to their answers, most people are quite eager to talk about the things that they care about. And that's the question I would always ask. What are the important issues to you? And try to get people talking. The second thing was I very quickly didn't feel self-conscious anymore, because I realized that as a canvasser, especially in politics, you get to become an expert in your community. You know every corner, not just the places you used to go to with your kids and friends. You know, you're going to all the church basements and the seniors' lunches and the Legion and the art shows and soccer matches, everything. And you become an expert. And I realized, in spite of that picture on the leaflet, it wasn't about me. It was about the community. And that I was just a conduit. I was the megaphone for that community. And that really empowered me and motivated me in running for elected office. And the third thing that I realized was the power of volunteers. Volunteers are the lifeblood of any campaign, any movement. And when we went door to door, if someone was enthusiastic about something we said or about an issue they cared about, we'd say, come, join us, you know, be part of this. And I used to think that volunteers were, you know, that they were doing us a favor, which they are, but we were doing them a favor by offering them the opportunity to act on the values that they care about, to act on the issues that they care about. And so we created a whole cadre of volunteers by the end of the campaigns, and I ran in many campaigns and for leader. We had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. You know, people say, what did you accomplish in politics? And I can, well, think. But the main thing I accomplished was building this group of volunteers. There is nothing more wonderful than inviting people in and having them act together for a common cause. That was what I learned. I just want to show a picture. This is me, it's an old picture, but with just a few of my crew, and we're obviously so happy because we're out canvassing, we're talking to people, and so many young people, like we would get so many young people in our campaign. When I ran for leader, we had this really young, engaged group, and I'm not sure why. It must have been, I must have had great organizers, but it was a great way to bring people in, and I learned so much from them. Tonight, I want to talk about the state of our democracy, which we're all concerned about, the threats to our democracy, which are numerous, the safeguards, and how we defend democracy. And I love this little cartoon by Michael Dieter, kind of the Statue of Liberty flicking a finger at you-know-who. So the state of our democracy is increasingly troubling. Autocracy is rising around the world. Some of the democratically elected leaders, currently or formerly, but all with very autocratic tendencies. And there are many more. There are many who are still in opposition, chomping at the bit to get into power. And I call this the rise of strongman democracies, and some of them end up not being democratic at all. I could call them strong men, but as you well know here, they can be women as well. Yeah, no kidding. They all seem to have this cult of the leader, that somehow they need to be at the center of everything, that without them, this movement is nothing. They all have a populist narrative, often with very emotional appeal, sometimes to a nostalgic past or to some future that's going to be wonderful. And they do a number of things. Usually they weaken democratic checks and balances, disregard election laws, use laws to attack their opponents, appoint loyalists to the judiciary, appoint loyalists all over the place, attack traditional elites, traditional practices, attack the media, and use disinformation and misinformation to get their message out, and suppress dissent. I mean, it's shocking to see the military move into cities in the US, just generally the suppression of dissent. We see a disdain for liberalism, the liberalism really since the Second World War, the focus on human rights. And they are known for cronyism, appointing their friends, their buddies, which often leads to corruption. I think the perfect example of this is the ballroom at the White House and the money, the private money that's poured into that. So there are other factors that are threats to our democracy. Some people just don't vote because they don't think it matters. I've heard it. Doesn't matter who you vote for, doesn't matter who you elect, nothing changes. They don't like politicians. I teach a politics class at Toronto Metropolitan University, and it is really very interesting, the low level of civic awareness of some of the students. We've seen populists appeal to working class anger and resentment. I want to talk more about that in a minute, and affordability issues. And these are real issues. Anybody who has to buy food these days knows that. Union leaders, and I come from a union, they may say they support a progressive party, but their members may march out and vote for another party, a conservative party. So there's a disconnect sometimes. We've seen all of this growing polarization, and it seems that democracy is increasingly fragile. Who knows what this is? $1 trillion. Who has just been awarded performance pay of $1 trillion? Yeah, Elon Musk. And that is on top of his $470 billion as of last month. We see Jeff Bezos. The billionaires, the rise of the billionaires. We have 77 of them in Canada, according to Forbes magazine, 900 of them in the United States, and their vast wealth sways our governments, especially when you don't have rigorous campaign finance laws. And we see it in the States where the laws are increasingly written for the billionaires. We don't have the same infiltration of big money, but we need to be very, pardon me? I said bullshit. Well, having a campaign finance limit or a donation limit of $5,000 is not the same of no limit at all. So we need to be very careful about our campaign finance laws and our donation limits. But there's no way they're similar to what the Americans have. But they could be. I know in Ontario, our premier has just increased the donation limit. It's very dangerous when money can buy an election. And so we need to be careful about that. And here's a quote that I really think is important. It's by Bernie Sanders. Since 1975, nearly $80 trillion in wealth has been redistributed from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. The massive income and wealth inequality in America today is not only morally unjust, it is profoundly damaging to our democracy. And in 2023 alone, $3.9 trillion in wealth was redistributed up. And that would mean, if it were not distributed up, a $32,000 raise for every full-time worker in America. Which do you think most people would vote for if they knew that that was the situation? We don't get off the hook here in Canada either. In 2023, the 100 highest paid CEOs made on average $13.2 million, not billion, not yet. And these CEOs, they made 210 times the amount of the average worker. And that's increased dramatically over the last 20 years. At the CCPA, we do a CEO pay thing every January. And usually before 11 o'clock on the first day of work, these 100 CEOs have made what the average Canadian worker makes in a year. And this is the first day of work. So we have our own serious challenges here. There is a lot of resentment because a lot of people at the other end of the scale aren't doing very well. We've had hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs lost, plant closures, technological change, which has lost more jobs. The Occupy movement pointed out the inequality but didn't point to the solutions. That's where we need to fill in the blanks. The Great Recession saw banks getting bailed out, and in the States, people losing their houses. Here, people losing their jobs. And COVID-19, the people who went to work every day, made sure we got fed, they cared for us, the nurses. Thank you, nurses. Thank you, healthcare workers, for your service. But the banging pots very quickly changed, and those heroes went to zeros, and the hero pay that was given to supermarket workers was taken away. So there was a huge amount of anger, and that anger gets fueled by social media, by influencers, and you know the backlash against institutions, blaming wokeism, immigrants, whatever. And I just want to read you a quote that stays with me. It's from a book that was written 25 years ago by a guy named Thomas Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. Kansas used to be a very progressive state, but anyway, here's what he says, I quote, "The trick never changes. The illusion never wears off. Vote to stop abortion? Receive a rollback in capital gains taxes. Vote to make our country strong again? Receive deindustrialization. Vote to screw those politically correct college professors? Receive electricity deregulation. Vote to get government off our backs? Receive conglomeration and monopoly everywhere, from media to meatpacking. Vote to stand tall against terrorists? Receive Social Security privatization. Vote to strike a blow against elitism. Receive a social order in which wealth is more concentrated than ever before in our lifetimes, in which workers have been stripped of power and CEOs are rewarded in a manner beyond imagining." That was 25 years ago. And I think we are living that. As you can see, the rise of inequality and the decline of unions, especially private sector unions. Employers have really doubled down in terms of fighting back against unions, and the fact is our outdated labor laws mean that most workers can't get a union in the private sector. The growth of the gig economy means workers are classified as independent contractors and are not covered by basic labor protection. And yet, workers who are in a union make 10% more on average than other workers. And union workers tend to reduce gender, ethnic, and racial wage gaps because people are part of a bargaining unit where you're paid by the job, not by who you are. They pay more in taxes because they have higher wages. They use fewer public benefits because they have private benefits. And they increase civic and democratic engagement. So the threat is inequality, but there are other economic threats to Canada right now, coming from the US, obviously, tariffs disrupting many sectors of the economy, some of that leading to higher consumer prices and lack of affordability. The pull from the US to take further manufacturing jobs out of Canada. One of my kids works in an auto plant. Their plant shut down for retooling of an electric vehicle. Guess what? That electric vehicle is now going to be produced in the States. They don't know if they're ever going back to work. Thousands of people. There's a couple of plants like that. Thousands of people. And the impact of the US undermines initiatives such as getting big tech companies to pay their fair share of taxes. Remember that bill that we were going to bring in? Guess what? Gone, because the US didn't like it. That was the Canadian government complying with the US insisting that we not tax those big tech companies. And I think we have difficulty setting our own fiscal policy because our governments want to keep our corporate taxes lower than those in the US, supposedly to attract investment. We see increasing security threats. There are wars, genocides, and the destabilization of the growing power of China and India, and the focus on the Arctic, where, ironically, because of climate change now, corporations are chomping at the bit to go and exploit that very sensitive ecosystem in the Arctic. And of course, President Trump has threatened to annex Canada, Greenland, and Panama, and we've seen his foreign policy by force. Also, wait for it, there's the possibility of the Golden Dome, a shield brought to you by Lockheed Martin. Will it work? Who knows? Could cost $71 billion. No public debate. We defeated this 20 years ago under Paul Martin. We'll see where it goes today. And of course, climate threats. We see the world burning, and yet our country is moving further away from its climate pledges, abandoning electric vehicles, the carbon tax, and our international goals. And of course, as you know well, here in Alberta, the threat to our charter rights and our human rights, overriding the charter with the notwithstanding clause 4 times, not once, but 4 times, to undermine and attack some of the most vulnerable people in our society, trans kids, and workers who are fighting, education workers fighting for our kids to make sure that they have decent funding and an adequate class size so the teachers can actually teach. Yay, teachers. And you know, those teachers didn't have strike pay. They were out on strike defending Alberta's kids without strike pay. So they really are heroes. Using the notwithstanding clause to take away their democratic rights to bargain freely and the right to go on strike is, anyway, that ought to light everybody's fire in this room. But we also have opportunities. So don't run and hide under the bed because of all these threats, because we have so many opportunities here. The fact is, now, I think people see the picture much more clearly. Nobody can look at Elon Musk and not see a picture of greed, incredible greed. No one looks at Jeff Bezos and thinks philanthropist. The excessive greed, the flaunting of wealth, people see that. They see that billionaires change the rules to help themselves and insulate themselves and let everyone else pay the price. They don't mind letting the world burn because they always have a safe place to go. And the impact of this, of course, is underfunding our education system, privatizing our health system. That's another thing to get very excited about here in Alberta. General austerity as things are moved from the push from the public to the private. We have democratic safeguards here, and we need to insist on using them. We do have a stable parliamentary democracy. I have been an election observer in many countries. I was in South Africa, where people died for the right to be able to have equal rights and vote. So they value democracy a lot. And I've also been to dictatorships. I was in Franco's Spain and Pinochet's Chile, where if you get on a bus and there's a soldier with a machine gun, nobody's talking. Nobody's talking, because nobody dares say anything. So let's not take for granted what we have. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that I've been to countries where people vote, but they know the result is fixed ahead of time. They know that the party or the person in power appoints the election commission. They appoint the officials who are going to be counting the votes. They know it's not fair. We at least have Elections Canada here. They're imperfect. I'm sure we, in my campaigns, we complained about them. But we have an independent electoral system here. We have a stable parliamentary democracy. And we have things like the parliamentary budget officer. The budget officer, that role is to look forward and see when a party or a government brings out a budget, what is that likely to do? Is that going to be balanced? Is that reasonable? Can they pay for this? Does it make sense? So that's what the budget officer does. And then the auditor looks backwards. Did it make sense? Did we pay for it? Was it affordable? And we have an ethics commissioner. So these are institutions that need to perform better and need to be more transparent. We have a constitution and charter rights and the rule of law. and we cannot let them be undermined. Alberta should be up in arms right now about what is happening with the notwithstanding clause. We have independent courts, unlike the US, where judges loyal to the person in power go after his enemies. We cannot let that happen here. We also have an educated and informed population. Compared to some, I said we need more civic education, but compared to many places, we have a very educated population. And we have a high level of engagement. I mean, everything from community events, kids' sports, people like to get together, people help each other, and we have so many activists. I'm so impressed with the activists for Palestinian rights, young people who show up every week, and their determination, their activism is inspiring. And we have some new progressive independent media which can provide an alternative point of view, and I think we should be supporting them. So the US is a cautionary tale, and we can be proud that we're not in the US, but only if we safeguard what we have. So here's what I think we need. To defend democracy, first of all, we need an alternative vision. What do we want? What is it we want our democracy to do? Well, both the Parkland Institute and the CCPA offer research for the public good. When did you last hear the government or even the budget say that it was for the public good? That's what we should be standing for. And the alternative federal budget, we just put it out federally, and it offers a vision of Canadian sovereignty and independence, not defense of the old neoliberal economic system, but truly independent, sovereign, self-sufficient Canada that we can build. And an industrial strategy that's focused on sustainability. There's so much we can do with an alternate energy grid, with a sustainable, energy-efficient housing. There's so much we can do, so many jobs that we can create. But we also need bold taxation measures to pay for it. Those billionaires, there should not be any billionaires in this country anywhere. We need that money. Somebody says there's not enough money to pay for our kids' education. There's lots of money, and governments have the power to access that through taxation. They'll say, oh no, those billionaires will move away. They don't want to stay, let them go, but they can leave their money behind as far as I'm concerned. The key is we need to think big, we need to know what we want, and then we need to figure out how to get it. And basically the goals, I think probably shared goals. This doesn't cover everything, but we want to reduce inequality. We don't want to see people living in misery. Just like we don't want billionaires, we don't want people living in misery. We want to defend human rights, good jobs, strengthen our economy, improve union protection, increase the wealth of our country, support public education and civic education. People should know what our governments, what our elected people are all about. We should have greater accountability. So we need more oversight, more transparency. You know, it's funny that so much of what gets done in Ottawa is in little tiny print, in documents that are kind of squirreled away. I don't know about you, I don't get up in the morning looking at parliamentary reports. Maybe I should, but we need to make these more transparent and accessible to people. And for ethics violations, there ought to be clear penalties. It's very discouraging when our politicians break the ethics laws and the punishment is just that people know about it. How does that make any sense? I don't get that. So we need actual punishment and we need enforcement, and enforcement of anti-corruption laws. People should not be hiring their friends and relatives and doling. In Ontario, there's a big scandal. The government's been doling out all kinds of money to private corporations that just happen to donate to that party. So we need to enforce our anti-corruption laws. And we need to reduce corporate concentration in the media. And that's so important. I put it on 2 slides. Because there's no way we should have a handful of corporations, private corporations, for-profit corporations, deciding what everybody in this country gets to see and hear. How is that right? So we need to reduce corporate concentration and increase oversight of our media, especially social media, and flag disinformation and, frankly, ultra-right-wing content. I don't think we should just let that flourish. We have to challenge fake news and create more opportunities for engagement and debate. And by engagement, I think public discussion with people you disagree with is a good thing. I think it's a positive thing. So what tactics can we have? Well, democracy obviously is about people. The way we defend democracy is with people. You seem like a pretty engaged crowd here. How many of you get involved in campaigns? How many of you would consider yourselves activists? Good, good. I want to persuade all of you to be activists. I talked about canvassing at the beginning. To engage people, I think we need to be constantly canvassing, and by that, I mean talking to people we don't even know, knocking on doors. What I used to do was get a petition going, a petition on anything in the riding. It didn't have to be federal. It could be a swimming pool. The city was going to close down a swimming pool, and so we got a petition. And I would just knock on the door and say, hey, I'm canvassing about this issue. What do you think? And so you get talking with people. And I know there's petitioners here. People were signing up the petition about the education system. Bravo. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. Go around the neighborhood, knock on doors, engage with people who don't necessarily want to open their door. Try to be persistent. Expose anti-democratic behavior. And this, I think, is important because we cannot let governments get away with this. This notwithstanding clause stuff. This is bullshit. It really is. There's no way this should be happening. It is undermining our human rights, and it is anti-democratic. So, and it's not just happening here. We had in Ontario, a government try to override a strike, deny strikers. And what happened in Ontario was the strikers didn't go back to work when the government used the notwithstanding clause. And I'm not comparing that to the teachers. It was a different situation there. But Premier backed down. And I think we need to begin to generate that kind of momentum. And we need to shame greed. How can people get away with being so greedy? There should be no billionaires. And we need to ridicule them. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's the importance of satire and building community engagement. Strong men hate to be shamed and ridiculed. They really do hate it. Strong men hate to be laughed at. You're going to have Rachel Gilmore here. I think she's still coming, isn't she? She's amazing. I am such a fan. Bubble Pop, and she says, the person you least like person that they least like or something. Anyway, it's
favorite person.
Least favorite person, yeah. And, satirical cartoons like Michael Diato, there's many of them. I love reading those things. My son sent me this YouTube, and it's quite long. If you've got an hour you want to kill. It's called The Silencing of Me, How Feminism, Wokeness, DEI, Marxism, Transness, and several other things brought Western civilization to its knees, by Peter J. Jordanson. Of course, it's a satire of Jordan Peterson, and it's got all of his pompousness and certainty of his rightness. It's really quite amusing. I mean, there's probably many more. I'd love to see a list of these. There's an outfit called the Juice Media. Anybody ever watch their stuff from Australia? They are great, but they do YouTubes in Canada and all over the world. And they are so funny, but they are so smart and so right on the money, calling out right-wing, wherever it is. I love their stuff. So what can activists do? It's a room full of activists. Well, we have to start where people are at. And I go back to my first canvas. You got to ask people questions. You got to listen to them. Something very powerful happens when you ask someone a question, you get their opinion, and you actually listen to them. And I think doing that more, especially with people we don't necessarily agree with. I'm not talking people where you're diametrically opposed, but people you may, they're not your usual circle. I think that's so important. We need to discuss and debate and defend what we believe in without attacking. But we have to be ready with those sharp replies. We have to know our facts to be able to answer. We have to show up. There is power in numbers. I was talking about getting the government of Ontario to step down with the notwithstanding clause, we just kind of shut down the center of the city, which was power in numbers. And so engaging others to show up, creating a campaign on, I mean, there's obvious campaigns that the Premier here is creating for us, but there could be many local campaigns. And we need to share power. Sometimes I would talk to people, say, in a riding association, and they would say, nobody wants to volunteer. It would turn out that they don't want to share the responsibilities and the roles. The people have to be able to play a meaningful role, and you have to reach out to them and bring them in. I've got a picture here of Zura Mamdani, and he's obviously an extremely talented leader. Bravo, New York! So he's a great talent. But we can't just wait for leaders. We have to organize, and we have to be ready for when a leader emerges, as they do. And you don't even know who the leaders are until they get a chance to show what they can do in campaigns. So defending democracy, I just want to give you an example. There's a researcher in our office, Ricardo Tranjan, who wrote a book called The Tenant Class. And he's really talking about how corporate landlords are exploiting working people through the fact that they're tenants. And I love this quote. He says, what if there is no housing crisis, but instead a housing market working exactly as intended? What if rent hikes and eviction notices aren't the work of the invisible hand of the market, but of a parasitic elite systematically funneling wealth away from working class families? So enter Chiara Padovani. Chiara Padovani is a tenant organizer in the West End of Toronto. She's a tenant, and there are some of these great big corporate-owned buildings in her area. So she assembled volunteers, and they started organizing and organizing and organizing. And they brought together the tenants, and I mean, they made it fun. They had lots of social events. But they organized rent strikes. So these big buildings went on strike, and people refused to pay their rent because the rent hikes were too high, buildings weren't maintained, people were being evicted, and they did this for months until they got the attention of the corporate landlords because they weren't getting their money. That gets their attention. And finally, they sat down with Chiara and her team, and they bargained a collective agreement on behalf of these tenants. Now, there's no laws governing this. They just did this, and now they have agreements with these corporate landlords that limit the amount of rent that they can pay, that stop the evictions, and that fixed their units because there was so much backlog of repairs that needed done. Now, the tenants needed to pay the rent that they hadn't paid, but they didn't pay the exorbitant increases. You know, it's like unions were before there were labor laws. People just went on strike until they got the particular thing they wanted, and then they went back to work. That's what these tenants did. I predict that one day there will be laws where tenants can collectively bargain with corporate landlords to protect their rights. I just think that's such a great example. Yeah, let's hear it for Chiara Padovani and the Tenants Union. So just to sum up, you've been very patient. How do we defend democracy? Well, I think we have to defend the material needs of working people. It's interesting, Mamdani and Trump met today, and they both talked about affordability, which is very interesting. We need better labor laws. We need, obviously, to address the climate crisis. We need to defend progressive media, and that means paying for it. We need to step up and run for elected office. We have a city councillor here, Councillor Jens, bravo. But we need more people to stand up like that. I never thought I would do it, but you never know what you can do until you do it. And we need organizing. I think the key is organizing, both inside and outside elected spaces. Democratic engagement builds community. It builds a force. It is the power of democracy. And no great campaign doesn't have food, celebration, joy, music. We need to have fun. So let's defend democracy. repel the current threat, and create a future built on the foundations of equality, justice, and solidarity. We only lose if we quit. Let's get out there and exercise our power together. Thank you. So, question.
Peggy, thanks for speaking to us tonight. You, of course, used to be an NDP MP. There's an NDP leadership race happening currently. What are your thoughts on it?
Oh, boy, easy first question. I'll tell you, I know I met the Heather campaigners tonight. I don't have a horse in the race yet. Of course, I am with the CCPA, which is a charitable not-for-profit organization, as Parkland is. I ran for the NDP leadership many years back after Jack Layton died because I thought it needed energy, it needed a vision, it needed to get people involved, and I still think that's the case. I don't think we have had that in the last few years in the NDP, so I don't know. I'm going to look at all the candidates. I wish there was more profile to it. I don't see a lot of things happening. I don't see it punching through in the media, and that's the way we communicate with a lot of people. So those are my initial thoughts.
When it comes to authoritarianism, you've drawn our attention to the fellow south of the border. We've talked about our premier. What are we to think of the banker that we've elected to be our prime minister? How does he fit into that, into that spectrum? Has he shown such definite authoritarian tendencies? I think he has, but what do you think?
You know, when he was first elected, he held a news conference and raised some of the things that he wanted to focus on, and I was really taken aback because he talked about interprovincial trade, which means deregulation. He talked about austerity, cutting back jobs, talked about pipelines, funding the military, and he has, of course, followed through on all of that. I have been very concerned about that. Correct me, I don't see the kind of strongman qualities being exerted that I pointed out in the authoritarian leaders. I don't see him as an authoritarian leader. I think he was democratically elected. I may not agree with the direction he wants to take the country.
Hi, thank you so much. I just had a question. What is democracy to you? Like from your perspective, your experience as an MP, as a Canadian. I mean, I was born in Venezuela, so this is a really hard question for me to think about, and I would like to know what are your ideas from your experience particularly. Thank you.
Yeah, it's people power. That's democracy. That's what it means from the Greek. That's why I talked about activism and people getting involved in campaigns, but it's also about voting. So we need governments that represent the people. And I didn't really get into it. I could spend another hour talking about proportional representation because I think we would have a much better system if people's votes were fairly counted. But democracy is people being able to express in a fair way their views and have that represented in their political systems and their power structures.
Hi, I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of political parties needing to meet the people rather than expecting the people to meet the political parties. So for example, I don't think there's a lot of messaging around alternative visions to what we're currently experiencing. There's just a lot of platitudes like, oh, we believe in public health care, but not a lot of conversation around what that means, what that looks like, and how they're going to achieve it and what the principles are. And that's something I noticed that's a distinct difference between Spanberger and Mamdani in the United States, is they very clearly articulated the mechanism. But here, particularly in Alberta, the NDP is failing to meet the moment. They are not articulating a mechanism. They are not articulating a vision. And when we ask about it, they get defensive and they tell us that we just don't get the point. And that's really difficult to meet a political party when they don't ask questions. They just tell us that we don't get them.
Mm-hmm. I think the more concrete parties can be, especially when they're campaigning, I think that's the key thing. I mean, Mamdani had like 4 or 5 key things, fast and free transit, groceries, community grocery stores, the child care. The key is if we're going to be able to do the things that we want to do, I think we need to be specific, but we also need to say how we're going to do it. And that's why I really liked being finance critic, because it's where does the money come from? So I am a big believer in taxing wealth, whether it's wealthy corporations or wealthy individuals, and using that money to be able to benefit, for the public good, to be able to benefit the majority. So you can't just say, well, we want better health care. You have to be able to say, okay, every person is going to have a family doctor, and here's how we're going to pay for it. I think you have to be specific. But I'm not being critical of what other parties are saying.
So my question is, as we talk about holding people accountable for their words and right-wing media and right-wing comments, I'd love to know your opinion on the new Jordan Peterson Act.
I wasn't aware of that, but what I do know is Rachel Gilmore has a statement on this, is rather than saying LGBTQIA+, dropping the T off LGBT and saying lesbian and gay or gay and lesbian. So it's like denying the reality of the other existences. I just see it's part of an attack on diversity and equity. I mean, watch the YouTube of Peter Jordanson. You know, maybe send that to Danielle Smith and see what she thinks about it. He's so huffy and so prickly and so thin-skinned. I feel sorry for his fragile emotions.
You mentioned proportional representation, and obviously many of us would know in Canada, electoral reform is kind of stigmatized because of the Trudeau government's broken promises on the same thing. I find that when I've campaigned, though, many people who are campaigning to be elected to federal or provincial politics will say electoral reform is the issue that is not something that matters to the people of X constituency. And obviously, multiple citizens' assemblies and the people who voted for Trudeau in his first term would disagree. So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, given your position on proportional representation, when we're thinking of future campaigns, where should electoral reform sit on the podium of issues that matter when it comes to democracy and representing the citizenry?
Well, I think it is important in terms of fair representation. What I would say is that at the federal level, it's extremely difficult right now to bring that in because it would take a constitutional change. Where I think it is more likely a possibility is in provincial government. I think that would make sense. There's been so much misinformation about proportional representation. I know we had a referendum in Ontario a number of years ago under Kathleen Wynne, but it was over the summer, and the government didn't really put any information out on it. And the editorialists and columnists were all against it. There was a huge backlash against it. But it's funny, in our community, myself and my provincial colleague, we campaigned for it, and guess what? People in our area voted for it because they had the information. So it tells you something, that if you can get the information to people, and explain what it really means and be able to answer questions about it. I mean, the fact is most other countries in the world operate this way. I think that it's more likely possible at the provincial level.
I'm still struggling to understand the distinction between the authoritarian guy and the democratically elected guy, because the government budget included something like $1 billion for AI research and $5 million for a dental plan. And I don't know anybody that needs AI, and I don't know anybody that doesn't need their teeth. So I don't know what the difference is.
It doesn't mean they're authoritarian just because you disagree with his spending. I totally agree with you that I would rather have that money go into the dental plan. I'd rather not spend 5% of our GDP on the military. I would rather have that money go into our healthcare system, our education system. That's what governments do. They make choices, they bring in budgets. I'm very concerned about the AI. I think it's going to take jobs away. It takes huge environmental resources. There's all kinds of questions. At the CCPA, we're doing some research tables. There's 5 of them, and the first one is on AI. I'm really hoping that it will have an impact in terms of public awareness about the concerns with AI. Those wouldn't be my budget choices. Those are his. I don't think it makes him authoritarian.
So we talk about the obvious importance of taxing billionaires and corporations and stuff like that. But then there's also, we talk about, Trump and how he's the destructive tariffs. And now we're noticing that groups like the Libertarian Party are jumping in and equating, basically talking about how tariffs are taxes on multinational corporations and trying to use that on anti-tax narrative. How do you think we should combat that?
Tariffs are taxes on corporations. Well, they're more taxes on people who end up paying higher prices. I mean, the tariff thing is, I think, a kind of a mercantilist thing from the US. They want to basically safeguard their economy and that other people are going to pay the price. The fact is, the right wing will always go after taxes because rich people don't want to pay them. And it means that more will be pushed into the private sector rather than the public sector. I'd rather focus on taxes being taxes and talk about the use that taxes go to pay for the public good and how the people who can afford to pay, they already do. We have a progressive tax system. It needs to be much more progressive. I mean, I would rather just raise corporate taxes. I mean, I am concerned about the tariffs. I mean, it is damaging our economy. It's complicated. And I know that the goal of the Americans is to pull our jobs into the States and disadvantage our economy. So I think we have to resist the tariffs because of that, not because they might be taxes. I think we should tax corporations. I think they should pay their fair share. The amount of money that Canada's banks, the grocery giants, some of these other corporations are making, we ought to have a surplus profit tax that gathers some of this money back.
Remember you actually talking about the institutions that protect our democracy, like elections, Canada, or election in Alberta, the governor, the Auditor General. My question is, the Alberta government is actively denying funds to these independent institutions, such as the recall petitions for Elections Alberta, not continuing our Auditor General of Alberta. How can we as a society, as activists, protect these institutions? I mean, there's activism, engagement, and actually talking to people, but is there any other potential solutions or strategies for us to actually protect these institutions that are independent?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a great question. And it just proves the point that it's a way to go after democratic institutions, is underfund them, discredit them, disregard them. Publicizing what they're doing is one piece of it. I think there are some people who will care, and getting that word out, again, not everybody, I don't know the public debate here, but maybe everybody doesn't know what these institutions do and what underfunding will do to our democracy. That's why I think the transparency and the communication is so important. If Nike advertised the way our governments do, nobody would ever buy running shoes. There's ways of communicating with people that you want them to get the information, and that's not what this usually is. So I think shining a light on it is really important, and then organizing, letting people know. Now, the reality is the government may not care if people dislike it. On the other hand, there will be an election one day, and the more people know about what they don't like, it informs their vote when they get there.
You've asked, is democracy under threat? Yeah, I believe it is here in Alberta. I believe it was the ethics commissioner actually said Danielle Smith is a threat to democracy. Her actions, what she was doing, that was like a year ago or more, I think, and the ethics commissioner was fired, replaced, let go. And also here in Alberta, you used to be able to vote, and if the people staffing the election polls were able to vouch for you, yeah, that's my neighbor, he lives here, and it's a legitimate vote. Danielle Smith recently, for the most recent election, changed it so you need government ID only. So there's a lot of unhoused people and people who don't have a driver's license or a government ID. So without a doubt, democracy is under threat here in Alberta for those two reasons alone. It was stated explicitly by the Ethics Commissioner, it is under threat.
You know, it's interesting, I didn't know that they had changed the voting rules here in Alberta, but that is what Stephen Harper did when he was in government for federal elections. And there was a huge debate about it. I showed the frog in the boiling water. Usually these things don't happen in one fell swoop. They go incrementally. The underfunding of institutions, the ethics commissioners report, the changing of the voting rules, things happen incrementally. And then all of a sudden, boom, the water's boiling. So I would take these things very seriously. I don't have a magic wand that says this is how people can get this changed. All I know is finding out about it, letting people know, and organizing people against it so that there's as much pressure and as much resistance as possible. You know, it's funny, in the US, you know, Donald Trump has established this almost like a cult where he's the strong man at the center of everything. And it made me think of Louis XIV. I was a French student. Louis XIV, who said, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. I don't know if that was the spark for the No Kings rally in the US, but he was behaving as though he were a king. And I think it's a dangerous time. Things can change. I don't know if the Epstein files will suddenly, you know, change things badly for him, but it's a dangerous time where I think if someone like that is cornered, they might do something desperate that could take us to an even darker place. So I worry about it.
In your talk, you mentioned the dropping of the tax of the big social media companies. And of course, that was under the influence of the United States. I tend to think of Canada as a semi-independent country and think that we would be more democratic because people would have more control over things if we were more independent. So my question is, do you think that there is value in international solidarity between Canada and other countries that are trying to become more independent of the United States?
Yes. Yes, I do. I mean, we're living next to a superpower, right? When the economy was expanding and things were good, we benefited from that. And we certainly have kind of tucked under their kind of military, whatever. We don't worry about being attacked. Remember that elephant and the mouse analogy. It's suddenly we're sleeping next to a tiger. And when that tiger rolls over, it can show its teeth. So we, I think, need to be more independent, more sovereign. But yes, of course, we live in the bigger world, and there are lots of countries with similar values that we can align with and trade with, strengthen our economy with. I think those would be much better for Canada.
I hate to say this, but it's not just happening, the erosion of democracy on a country to country or in a province. It's happening in the municipal level as well, where we have a deep lack of transparency, lack of accountability. You have to file FOIP requests to find out where our tax dollars are going. Discontinuance of public engagement, absolute ignorance to public feedback. I wanted to remind you or encourage you to consider the municipal government level as well when you're discussing the erosion of democracy, because it's happening here in Edmonton, and to ask you your thoughts on how we defend democracy in the face of that.
Thank you for that question. You know, the great thing about municipal governments is they're the closest to people. And they're what people see every day. It's funny, I used to go knocking on doors and I'd ask, do you have concerns about the environment or, you know, international relations? And it's garbage, graffiti, and speed bumps. Those were the three top issues. And so I spent a lot of time with the city councillor on speed dial. I think that it's probably easiest to hold city councillors to account and by organizing people in their community. I mean, maybe someone like you wants to step up and run. If you don't like the way things are going, build a team and build support and take them on. Like, somebody has to do it.
I'm very active in that area. We have corporate welfare going on with our tax dollars. We have, I mean, my point is the math everywhere. It's infiltrating to the municipal level.
It is the dominant, under our kind of neoliberal economic system, this kind of monetization of democracy and pushing everything to the private sector is happening everywhere. It doesn't mean it is inevitable. I look at a guy like Mamdani and others who have challenged that logic. And there's a reason why Trump and Mamdani spoke about affordability. I think that people can be reached on their day-to-day issues, and once they know what's going on, they can be appealed to. I think people are pretty smart, and if they know what the score is and they see one door opens to a world which is not very good for them, and another door opens to a world where they can live a better life and their kids get better education and their garbage gets picked up, et cetera, why wouldn't they choose that door?
My name is Jason Cormier. I'm here as a representative of CUPE in Calgary as an individual local, but I'm also a president of the Calgary District, of the CUPE Calgary District Council. And I also sit on the Calgary District Labor Council as secretary. We also put on through the nonprofit Calgary Future. Talking about municipal elections in Calgary, we've been fairly successful through the Calgary Future, where the local unions got together, created a nonprofit, and we vetted on the municipal election side of things the representatives that most aligned with our values. Mm-hmm. The past not this current one, but the past one, we helped with 11 candidates to council. This time around, we weren't quite so successful, but it wasn't that bad. But to address what was going on in Edmonton on the civic level is to organize, if you're able to, through your council, locals, councils, and start planning now like we are for the next election, is to try and elaborate and continue the pushback on the authoritarian types and the progressives for better housing, better street values on the municipal level, because if you can win on the municipal level, you can have an effect on the provincial level, and if you can have an effect on the provincial, then maybe you can start having an effect locally on the federal level.
That's a great example. Thank you for that. I've seen that work in Vancouver. It has worked in Toronto, where you get a progressive group together. It could be Labor Council. It could be, usually there's Labor, but community leaders, and you endorse progressive candidates and help them and canvass for them and focus on those councillors' campaigns. So that has been very effective. Congratulations. I think that's a great success. Good for you.
I was a former MLA here and current union leader. Resonated with a lot of things that you were talking about, but knowing that, I'm sort of asking what might be an unfair, difficult question for you. But we expect there's likely to be a provincial election here this coming spring. It's not technically supposed to be until fall of 2027, but there's lots of indicators that could be coming this spring. So we are in a pre-election period, and everybody in this room needs to be part of doing what you're talking about. I can only hope that the Alberta NDP, which I have put my heart and soul into at different times, will come forward with the energy and the vision that will get people involved. But we cannot let the UCP win, even if they tank at that. So just some thoughts around what organizing looks like in that kind of situation, where you don't have that amazing, inspiring vision at the end, but you have this horrible, nasty, potential for that, right? Because you don't want a negative campaign, but also how do we, despite maybe, I can hope, but if they don't get there, any thoughts on how, same with the federal party, if they don't step up, if we don't end up with a leader in vision, we still want them to, do better. So besides being involved with the party and which I will continue to do. Do you have any thoughts on what organizing and being involved in campaigning looks like, you know, in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for your involvement, by the way. It takes a lot to step up, so thank you. I would just run local campaigns. Like, you can do that locally. I remember one campaign I ran. We didn't like the literature from the garbage. We did all our own stuff, and we campaigned like an independent, but, you know, whatever, had the benefits of a party. So I would just focus on strategically on the areas that are most winnable and run an activist campaign where you can.
Ms. Nash, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to express a sense of worry, I guess. My concern is that a lot of this conversation has been around safeguarding a particular version of democracy, a version of democracy that has led us to the crisis we are today, that has led to a housing market that is completely in the hands of the rich, that has neglected the voices of indigenous peoples in this country, that has continuously put down workers and has created a situation where solidarity strikes remain illegal. So I ask, is it worth preserving and defending this democracy rather than advocating for the expansion of it and demanding more from our democracy instead?
Let me just ask you, what do you mean by demanding more?
For example, I believe that tenants unions should have more power, workers should have more power. I believe we need to have workers in positions of power in companies. There needs to be an expansion of union rights. I think, for example, indigenous people actually really need political power rather than platitudes from our government, something that none of the parties in our current establishment have actually advocated for whatsoever except in rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. I think I talked about the importance of tenant unions and that we ought to have that in law. We ought to have better workers' rights. That's something I have fought all my life for. I could imagine a different system of government where there are a certain number of designated seats, perhaps, for Indigenous leaders or Indigenous candidates. That occurs in other countries. So I could see different systems in place. Yeah, I think we need more democracy, not less. But I guess the point I was trying to make is, let's not discount everything that we have, because while we want better, we also need to fight so that what we have doesn't get worse. So I think it's maybe both things at once.
So I'd like to ask about unions. In order to start my master's program, a little over a year ago, I quit my job at Canada Post on Labor Day.
Good timing.
Yeah. But before that, I was pretty involved with the union. I was the chief shop steward of the Edmonton North Zone, for instance. I did work in the office, you know, like I was pretty involved. And one of the things that we often said at CBW was that there are no successful legal strikes. That every strike that has produced significant material change in this country, in this country's history, has been illegal. You know, you predict that tenants will one day have the right to collective bargaining, which is, you know, that would be amazing. But my concern is that this country is moving in a direction of, you know, you can protest peacefully if you're in this taped off area. And as long as we allow you to. You can strike, but only as long as we allow you to. And that defeats the entire purpose of striking. It defeats the entire power of collective organization. How do we safeguard against that?
It's been a long time debate in the labor movement. There have been strikes to get a union security clause, but then there is the argument that the union security clause may undermine canvassing and organizing in the workplace because the funding is guaranteed because of union dues checkoff. This is a long time debate. You know, the fact is you can make laws that limit what workers can do. Ultimately, a worker's going to decide, and workers will decide collectively, if they withdraw their labor or not. Now, a legal framework is something that has won strikes. Many historic strikes, and the postal workers have had some of them that gained us so many advances in Canada. I think laws can protect you, But if they don't protect you and they're inhibiting you, you can go outside the law. And I think of the refusal to comply with the notwithstanding clause in Ontario. Those workers were individually threatened with huge fines. The union was threatened with a huge fine, but nobody could force them back to work. So at the end of the day, a law is only as good as its enforcement. And quite frankly, corporate business guys seem to get off quite easily with the law. They don't seem to get more than a slap on the wrist, so the laws don't seem to bother them. I think there are laws that will protect you. For example, sometimes a first contract arbitration law can protect you if you're in a strike that doesn't seem to be winnable. It can help you get a first agreement. So I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think if workers want a wildcat, they'll wildcat.
Great, thank you so much. Hope you'll join me in thanking so much for Peggy to be here, offer these important thoughts. I think get us started on the conference extremely well.